Oh, and then Allison, after we're wrapping it up, I'm going to turn it back to you to close us out, okay, to thank everyone, since you're really presenting this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I think that we should probably begin, and I want to start by thanking everybody for joining us this evening. I hope everybody's safe and warm from the snow that we're witnessing here in Chicago, for those who are joining us from Chicago. Before I introduce our moderator, just a few thoughts. First of all, I'm Allison Pierce-Slovan from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, a Midwest Regional Director, and I have the honor and privilege of working for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is an international Jewish human rights organization, named, of course, for the famous Nazi hunter, Mr. Wiesenthal. Though I hesitate to say named, of course, for Mr. Wiesenthal, the Nazi hunter, because unfortunately, most people that I meet never heard of him and didn't know what his legacy was. And that's part of our educational initiatives, and why we have to make sure that we have webinars like this to continue talking about the history of the Jewish people and the history of what transpired during the Holocaust. I'm very excited, and I thank my friend, who's become a friend, Howard Wright, for joining us. Howard was born in Chicago, and at the age of 10, he moved with his family to Skokie. And like our guests who are going to be speaking with him today, he is also, he is the child of survivors, though the others were grandchildren of survivors. But he was very affected by what transpired about his past and his history. However, professionally, Howard did write for the Chicago Tribune, covering the arts for almost, I think 30 years, and just recently retired. But one of the ways that Howard and I met was he wrote an extraordinary book, which I really, really hope people will read, and it's called The Art of Inventing Hope. He had the opportunity of years of discussions and conversations with Elie Wiesel. I thank you all for joining us. I think it'll be an interesting discussion. It's important for people to continue to remember how we've achieved following the Holocaust and how it's affected young people today. Thank you very much, Howard.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with three very distinguished members of the Israeli Consulate General for the Midwest. And all of us, really, I suppose every Jew has some connection to the Holocaust, whether they know it or not, or whether they acknowledge it or not. But we do acknowledge it, we recognize it. And so I'm going to ask all of them about our connection to this subject and how it has affected our lives and the work that we do. So let me please start with Daniel Aschheim. Daniel, would you just quickly tell us what you do at the consulate, and then tell us about your family's Holocaust story? Who lived and who did not?
Thank you very much, Howard. Thank you very much, Allison and the Simon Wiesenthal Center, for working together with the consulate here into the Midwest on this very important event. And my position, my role is the Consul for Public Diplomacy, and we are responsible for 9 states here in the Midwest. And my family Holocaust story, I would say it's a very different story than the usual stories, because on the one hand, I have grandparents who were, some of them were Ostjuden from East Europe, some of them were born and raised Berlin from my father's side, and we can discuss it later into details, but in general, they understood the message in the late 1930s, and they left Germany to South Africa, where my father was born, and then later he came to Israel, they remained there. Nevertheless, the interesting part of my family history connected to the Holocaust, I think, is actually my grandfather from my mother's side. So my mother's father, who for me was never a Holocaust survivor. For me, he was just Saba Yaakov from Naharia, and I always never considered myself a descendant of any Holocaust survivor, neither did my parents. And it was not the story of never talking about it or not wanting to talk about it. It was just the way I was raised. And the first time I actually dwelt into this topic was by accident 3 years ago, when I sat with my wife to discuss, and she came out of nowhere and just asked my mother, so tell me, what is the story of your grandparents, of Daniel's grandparents? And then my mother said, yes, so my grandfather Yaakov was born in 1912 in Turbin, Poland. At the age of 13, he attended a Talmud Torah in his town. After his bar mitzvah, he abandoned religious life, went to study in a Tarbut Hebrew school where the ideology was Hebrew in Hebrew and they instructed only in Hebrew. Then he liked horse riding, carpentry. This is the way I was born and raised. That's what I heard. Later, he was drafted to the Polish army, and very soon after that, the defeat of Poland by the Germans, he joined the Polish unit of the Russian army. And from there on, what I heard was that he remained and he built his family, and he had a brother who lived in Canada. And later on, my cousin and my mother's brother was born in 1942. Later on, my grandfather returned to Poland to search for his family. And soon after not finding any relatives, he was appointed to be a Hebrew Teacher Association in the DP camps in Germany, in Ulm, where my mother was born in 1947. He became part of the Zionist network, came to Israel. He became a first Hebrew school principal in Nahariya. Now, where does the story become interesting? After this conversation with my wife, then my mother said, yes, we don't know. The rest of the family, probably one died from a heart attack, another one in the woods. We don't really know. And we did a simple search in the Yad Vashem archives. This was 3 years ago. And we put the last name of my father, Avitov Gutvilik. And we suddenly see 23 testimonials written in the handwriting of my grandfather in 1952. And he put the names of all his relatives, his cousins, his brothers, his parents. He knew exactly where they were murdered, in which camps, in which areas, in which woods they were murdered. And this means that he was completely a Holocaust survivor. Nevertheless, it was never part of his legacy or heritage. And only recently do we dwell into these stories more. So I think this is the very special angle that I feel that just recently I'm getting more involved in this topic.
And this is where those names exist in Yad Vashem. This is the only
exactly because of my grandfather putting them in his handwriting, exactly detailing. Without him, no one would have ever known where they were or what was their destiny.
It's memorializing and preserving who they were in a way.
Exactly. Who they were, it was not, but where they died. I think the tragedy, and this is what needs to be changed, is we need to bring the stories of their lives, not only the stories of their death.
Yeah. Yael Jacobovici, also tell me what you do with the Consulate General, and I think you've got a fascinating story about your grandmother.
Yes, so first of all, thank you for inviting me. This is really important to me. I think this is the first time that I'm telling the story publicly. I never do this in a really wild environment, so I'm really excited about it. I work at the consulate for 1.5 years, almost 2 years now. I'm taking care of the part of the financial parts, all the administration, and I'm most of the time also helping the public diplomacy team in different events, like Yom HaZikaron for Israel, and a lot of public diplomacy in that side. And my story is also a little bit weird, the way that I found out actually all my roots to the Holocaust, because I was born and raised in Uruguay, in Latin America. My parents were born there, and I didn't know actually that we have any relations to the Jewish community or anything like that until I was in school. And we were studying just about World War II and global events. And my father was asked to participate in it, and I was confused because I didn't know why are they asking him. To everybody else, it was really obvious that I come from a Jewish family, from Jewish roots, but I didn't know that. My name kind of gave me away in that sense. Also my last name. But slowly I start to ask questions, and my father for a really long time, he was really close to those questions. It was a really sensitive topic. It still is a really sensitive topic. But later on, I found out that my grandmother was born in Lodz in Poland. She was kind of a regular woman, but unfortunately, she was arrested. She was forced to go through this whole Holocaust thing. She first was sent to the ghetto in Lodz. Then she was transferred to another famous camp in Germany, in Remsburg, where she suffered a lot of experiments. We're not sure. She also, afterwards, she was transferred again to Auschwitz. She was part of the Death March. And then when the war was over, somehow through the Red Cross, she found out that she had a few of her brothers that escaped right at the beginning of the war, and then they moved to Latin America. A lot of the parts of her story we don't know, basically because she will speak about it, but in different times and little pieces of the story, but not like, we don't know timelines, we don't know what kind of experiments they did to her, the details of it. We don't know about her whole family as well. We don't know what happened before the war. She was actually, they wrote her down like she was born on March 1st, but she wasn't sure if that was actually her birthday, because she was really young when everything started, and she kind of lost memory. And it was a really tragic story that it was really hard to her to speak. And when she did, it was, it was difficult, and we couldn't get it all together at once. We have all these mysteries around that we are never going to find out, I guess, because unfortunately she's gone. And also her friends were only survivors. She wouldn't hang out with other people. In Uruguay, there were only 200, maybe 300 survivors that arrived after the war. So her circle of friends was really, really small, and they will also have similar stories like hers, so they also didn't speak aloud about it. And some of them, after with the years, did. One thing that really helped was the Aschheim jury, when happened back in Israel a while ago, that he was actually, they catch him in Argentina. We have, I believe, for a while ago that she saw some Nazis in Argentina. That's why she crossed over to Uruguay. We don't know if that's true, but she always had that fear that came back to her when she was older, later in her life, that they were still chasing her. She had fear of people coming into her house. She will call my father in the middle of the night, ask him for help. My father will come, and then he will say, accuse him of being a German soldier and trying to, get him arrested and calling the police, and, whole neighborhood will wake up, and nobody will actually understood what happened or why she was acting that way. They will say that she has different diseases, like maybe she has Alzheimer, or maybe she has something else. And that's something that I feel is really unique to Holocaust survivors. People kind of misunderstood them. Right. In ways. I remember reading your book, which is really touching, when you were telling the same things about your mother.
Yeah.
And I was chilling, like I remember having all goosebumps all over my body, because it's something that it can be really easy misunderstood, and it's so sensitive to tell a person that, okay, you're not living there anymore. Right. You had the fear got away from you, but it's not something that you can do it in a day. So, to this whole thing erupt to the fact that my family, for a while, like, we will hang out with the Jewish community, but only on holidays. We wouldn't say 100% like out loud, I'm Jewish, not embrace it. Yeah. A really long time to us until I made aliyah in 2012. I made aliyah by myself. So I start to get to know this whole second generation and third generation. And then I start to understand even more the whole history of my own family through other people's stories. I visit Yad Vashem at least 10, 15 times, and still I still find out new things and that I can relate to my own history, my own story. So it is really important to tell this because people don't believe that second generations or third generations are getting, still being touched and traumatized by what happened 17,000 years ago. So it's really important to talk about it, and really thank you for being.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's so beautifully said. Yeah, the subject is with us all the time, whether we know it or not. Rabi, please tell us what you do at the Consul General for Israel in the Midwest, and what is your story? There's a very specific relative, Moshe, you told us about. Tell us your family's Holocaust story.
Good night, everyone, and thank you for having all of us. Thank you, Alison, for pulling this together, and thank you, Howard, for taking the time to manage this conversation. We appreciate it. It's really important at the personal level. Over the past 2.5 years, I've been the Chief of Staff to Consul General of Israel and Director of Political Affairs, coordinating the consulate effort with elected officials. My family story, I'll start by saying that both of my grandparents on my father's side are Holocaust survivors. But I will choose, with your permission, to focus on my grandfather, Moshe, Saba Moshe, story. So his story starts at 1924 in a small city of Patras, which is in the southern part of Greece, about an hour and a half west of Athens. He was the elder of six kids. Very, like you will imagine a Greek teenager, strong, tan, masculine, great at sports, loves soccer, do all of agriculture work, and as the Nazi invasion spread all over Europe and came to the doorstep of Greece, he ran to the mountains to join pro-communist opposition group called the Partisans. I joined them. We will visit home occasionally, about every other weekend. We'll do operations against the Nazi intruders. And one day, his squad was assigned a specific operation to blow up German supply train, supplying of food, arms, and ammunitions. It was doing its way just on the border, just north of Patras. This mission failed miserably. They weren't able to blow up the train. And I just mentioned that they were, the attempt was to blow up the driver's seat, right? So you don't want to mess everything up because you can take the leftovers. So we tried to blow up the driver's seat. They failed. And then this weekend he came back to his parents' house, like he did always. Although this time around it wasn't the parents' house. He knew there was no one at home. There were no one in the streets. And when he asked around, where's my family? They told him, well, the Nazi came and took them on a train earlier this week. The train that he failed to blow up was his family's train, and he will never see them again. As the war concluded, he fled to Israel because apparently working for pro-communist opposition groups was considered treason. So he fled to Israel. He met my grandmother, Rachel, who was also a Holocaust survivor with a pretty amazing story that I will not tell at this point, from Volos, which is near the Peloponnese in Greece. They built the home, they built the family in Israel. They lost the elder son, Aryeh, which I'm called after. My middle name is Aryeh. They got divorced. Their kids built their home and families. And I will conclude with one very touching data that I would like to share. So in Auschwitz, there is a room with a huge photo of a mother, few mothers taking after a group of children. When my grandfather visited Auschwitz and saw this photo, he said, "That's my mom. That's my mom." He came back home. He told the story to his family. His kids are older now. I was alive at this point. My father was alive. He came back home. He brought the story with him. A few years later, he passed. When I was on my journey to Auschwitz, I brought this picture as well with me, and I was in the room. And when I brought it up to the tour guide, he said, "Well, this is actually a group of Hungarian mothers who take after the children." But I was at peace because I knew that my grandfather passed away from this world, knowing that he had this memory, a visual memory of his mother. So that's my story. And again, thank you all so much for having us today.
Yeah. So I think we are all here today. We are here because someone survived. That's why we are here. That's why we live, because someone survived. And each one of us in his own way and her own way has found this story, or found part of this story, found what little part is left. So I want to ask each of you, what has the effect of knowing what happened? What is the effect on you? So maybe Daniel, how is this knowledge that you found 3 years ago or so, how has that affected you and your perception of yourself and your Judaism?
It's a good question, and after hearing these emotional stories and moving stories, I heard some parts before in our private discussions, but now hearing it in perspective, it gives you perspective of what it is, and also the different approaches for each one. Yael was born in Uruguay, I was born in Israel, Ran was born in Israel, so it's also very much connected. Where were you born, in which environment, whether you were born in America, in Europe, whether you were born to a community like Yael said, that she didn't know that she was Jewish, or the surrounding. And I was born as an Israeli, secular Israeli, into a parents who the Holocaust, my father researched, he's a professor of history, so part of his research dealt with Holocaust, but it was not the major part. Yeah. So I heard of it. I was in schools, in ceremonies, and we discussed it. We went to Yad Vashem, I didn't go to Poland, but a lot of my friends did. We discussed it. It was part of Israeli culture of memory. So when talking about culture of memory and memorials, whether it's physical, emotional, moral, or all kinds of memorials, for me, the Holocaust was a thing, another thing which is part of Israeli society. And it's very important to remember that the Holocaust is an integral part of Israeli culture of life today, for the good and for the bad. So there are critical parts and they're also very positive. So on my personal note, I think the Holocaust, the message we need to remember on the personal, the national, and humanistic level is one, never again, as we all say, we need to remember the Jewish people should be very strong. Therefore, as I also saw in the chat comments here written by Michael Trayson, the state of Israel is a miracle. It's a miracle we worked very hard to get. It came not as an easy miracle, but eventually it's there. And Israel is there to protect every Jew on earth, whether living in South America, Africa, Europe, Southeast Asia, or wherever in the world. And the other lesson we need to do, and we need to also, of course, combat anti-Semitism wherever it is on the globe today. And the other message is for humanity. We need to make sure it will never happen to anyone else again. So no, we need to make sure that it's our responsibility, not only on Holocaust Memorial Day, not only on Yom HaShoah in Israel. Our message needs to be no to racism, no to hatred, no to discrimination, not only against Jews, not only against Christian, Muslim, or anyone else. It's our responsibility, and us as Jews who suffered this, and all of us as relative descendants of Holocaust survivors, and even more as representatives, official representatives of the State of Israel, to be the front of fighting racism and hatred all around the world. And what Alison and the Simon Wiesenthal Center is doing in projects that they're doing these days and other projects throughout the year is to bring the message that Simon Wiesenthal was the known Nazi hunter, but he was not only a Nazi hunter, he was the hunter of racism and hate wherever it is in the world. And I think on a personal note, where I was born into a family that they discussed it, and it was always the message that I got. You need to remember, the message never again needs to apply, and we are strong. And as a strong nation, we have to remember our responsibility towards the whole human race and towards our Jewish people. And I think the combination between both, because there are always discussions, whether the Holocaust is something we should look at as something that happened only to the Jews, will always happen to the Jews, and the message to the world should only be a Jewish message, or it's an event, it's a unique event in history that happened to the Jews, because I don't think there's doubt this was designated to the Jewish people, extermination, but the messages need to be humanistic messages to all the world.
Well, and this is exactly when I asked Professor Elie Wiesel about this when we were working on our book. He said he describes the Holocaust as a uniquely Jewish event with universal implication, and that sort of sums up what you just said. Yael, you found out this story about your grandmother. What effect did that have on you, and does it have on you as a woman in the world?
Well, I think that my journey was a little bit different from Ran and Daniel, in that I wasn't born in Israel, so I didn't felt being part of any Jewish society or anything like that. But later on, I did make aliyah eventually, which is the best decision that I ever had in my life. And my path to get there was actually to embrace my Jewish identity, especially in a way that now I'm not afraid anymore to say it, that of my past, of my history, of my family. But also one of the things that gets me motivated most of the time when I speak to someone that is either not Jewish or not related to the Holocaust or to anything like that, is one of the quotes from Elie Wiesel, when he was saying that he was most afraid of people that wouldn't speak up for those who are getting, in a bad situation. When we see another people being hurt, when we see another people that they are actually being molested for the fact that they're different, either for the color of their skin, for their religion, or whatever it is. And that's what I'm trying to do in my life, not to be afraid anymore, and to actually speak up for everybody. Doesn't matter who it is or where is it. I feel people, we're living actually today in a really sensitive time where we see this switch, this drift that we're getting even more and more extreme towards ideas, to whatever people believes, and those beliefs, they kind of blind you, and they won't let you see the other human being, the other human being that you have in front of you. They don't let you see the fact that, sometimes people, they just believe and they're different, and that's okay. And the worst thing is, again, when we don't speak up, when we just we see that something wrong is going on, and we look at the other side. It happened to the Jewish people, and we are definitely have to work every day to not let it happen again. It is a really hard thing to do. It's not an easy request, but it's something that we should do it. We have the moral responsibility, and we do it every day as much as we can. I just feel everybody should do that.
Again, as Elie Wiesel said, silence helps only the perpetrator, not the victim.
Exactly.
Ron, how did your knowledge of your family story affect you and what you do with your life?
So it's a very interesting question, because unlike Daniel and Yael, I grew up from the moment I was born. I knew that Saba Moshe and Savta Rachel are Holocaust survivors. It was plain simple, I knew it, but I don't think it really hits you on the head, the full capacity of it, or the full meaning of it, until recently, I would say. That's 6-7 years maybe. My grandfather always came to school to tell his story. He was never shy about it, but he wouldn't do it voluntarily. If you'll ask, he'll tell. And when he passed away, there was like something cracked in my family, this barrier where it's okay to talk about the Holocaust, not only when on the Yom HaShoah, on the International Holocaust Memorial Day, but also in day-to-day occasions. It's okay to ask, hey, Dad, what is like growing up with a father who is a Holocaust survivor? Hey, Dad, have you ever heard how Grandpa lost his family? Have you ever heard how they died? And like every crack, when you see the first crack, many follows, and eventually things just breaking open. And I'll never forget that in 2017, after my father's brother passed away, and he was the only survivor of his core family, he was invited to do a Zikaron Basalon, which is a beautiful, it's like a memory in the living room. It's transition to English. That's where you host either a survivor or this day, because unfortunately we have so few second generation of Holocaust survivor. And my father was debating whether he should do it or not. And we pushed him, and my mom pushed him, do it, speak about it, talk about it, tell about also your story. And I remember sitting there in the room and I was completely frozen. It was my dad, like I never saw him before. Very emotional, very shaky, but simultaneously very, very strong. And I think it meets what I do today in every intersection, whether it's a daily conversation, whether I'm reading the news. Yael and Daniel and Alison all the time a hothead. So when I get really upset when I'm hearing people under-talking the Holocaust or using phrases like concentration camps to describe situation as Stalin-Boden, to say Hitler was right. When I'm hearing those talks, you don't want to be anywhere near me. I'm getting all worked up. I think this fire is what eventually ignites and push my at least work, and I'm sure my colleagues as well, at Israel Consulate to ensure that people are educated, people know our families and their families in the story. And I will quote Consul General of Israel now, that we don't only need to learn our history, we need to learn from our history. And that's, I think, a main focus of our work in the consulate. I'm very proud to get up every morning and do this work for the State of Israel and for all of our families.
Thank you. Daniel, you mentioned about how central Holocaust awareness is in the State of Israel, which is understandable. Could you compare for me the perception of the Holocaust in Israel to the United States? How do you think people regard this how aware are they in the United States compared to Israel?
So it's a challenging question, because you can, in the United States, the question is who is commemorating? So whether are we talking about Jewish communities, also in the Jewish communities, are we talking about Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox? Are we talking about the more liberal perspective? Are we talking about the general United States government perspective, or the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the Illinois Holocaust Museum? I think these challenges of how do you remember and what is the memory? I'll talk a little bit about the Israeli perspective. The official Israeli perspective is also combined. I would say the Yad Vashem one is also to remember that the State of Israel was not founded because of the Holocaust. And this is an important distinction that many make mistakes around the world in those who commemorate. So a lot of times people come to Yad Vashem, leaders around the world, and say, yes, the Holocaust, then the State of Israel. And this connection is a very problematic question, because this connection makes it that if there was no Holocaust, there would not be a State of Israel. And it's true historically that because of the Holocaust, of course, it made things quicker, because there was a urgent need more than before. Nevertheless, it started, the Zionist movement came much before the Holocaust. There was anti-Semitism, of course, that pushed it, but it was not the Holocaust that brought the State of Israel. And this is the basis of the understanding in Israel. This event came, and it's a devastating event for the Jewish people. The Jews needed a strong country that will secure the lives, the basic needs and lives of any Jew around the world. And this is what the State of Israel is, one of its foundations. Sometimes it's used by politicians from both sides. Sometimes it's used not necessarily, I think, in problematic ways, whether in demonstrations. Some Jews call the Jews in the army or as in the police Nazis. The other ones call the rest Nazis. It's used by politicians. So the terminology is excessively used. I think in Israel, around the world, in America, we hear these things, and one needs to understand this message. Nazism, Holocaust, all of these things were an event in history, not like any other event in history. These atrocities against the Jewish people that were made by the Nazis and their collaborators are things, it's a stain on history and will remain a stain of history. No comparisons are needed. You can base your arguments. There are enough comparisons in other historical events. You can make historical events. You can compare other dimension of an event. You can, though, compare things that led to Nazism, which you need to be aware of in order not to repeat them in all kinds of methods. But using these things as a method of something today is very, very dangerous. Now, for instance, there are a lot of claims saying that the Iranian regime is also trying to take away the Israeli state, the state of Israel, and to get rid of the Jewish people who live in the state of Israel. These are very, very dangerous things from the Iranian regime. We need to be very, very careful not to let them do what they want to do. Nevertheless, we need to also remember that when we are talking about the Holocaust was something against the Jews as Jews, and we need to make sure that it will never again happen, and therefore that's part of the Israeli memory tool today.
Yeah, true. Yael, what do you find about awareness of the Holocaust in the United States? What is your sense of being here? Does the general public know, care, remember?
Well, we see that unfortunately, little by little, the awareness of the Holocaust is being lost. Like, people are not remembering the same way that they used to a few years back. This is not only happening in the US, it's also in Israel and everybody else around the world. That's why we need to work for not let that happen. But here in the US, I've seen a lot of things, good things from the Jewish communities, especially here in the Midwest, working really hard to remember every day, not only one day of the year. Also, Consulate is working really hard on it as well. But this is not only Jewish community thing or Jewish people thing. It should be something for everybody to remember. Like Daniel said, we can, it was a unique event and we shouldn't let it happen again. We see a lot of things around the world that are really similar, not the same, but still similar to the atrocities that our people went through. So the memory of the Holocaust, it should be something that everybody has responsibility on, not only those who were involved. Even more, a lot of people who were involved, or a lot of countries who were part of it, they're still trying to see, like, politically correct. No, I wasn't part of it. No, I wasn't. But it shouldn't be only one side trying to remember it, trying to do what is right for everybody else. Yeah, I think the US is taking care of it, but we should all be doing something.
Yeah. Ron, do you think, what is your belief as to why we're seeing this rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world, or has it always been there and it's just more out in the open? What is your reading about what's happening with this anti-Semitism today?
You know, it's a great question, and I had the eye-opening experience of having a dinner actually with Alison about a year ago with a former clan member, a neo-Nazi clan member. And I thought that, you know, post World War II, the Jewish people got about 50 years of the hook, anti-Semitism wise. But when I met him, he said that's definitely not the case. It's always been there. It's always somewhere, not even under the surface, but low key. Recently, I think, and it's present to say that it's being popularized, it's being politicized, and it's becoming more a tool that even if the person releasing some sort of statement that could be translated to anti-Semitic, it ignites the rage of the thousand of those angry people who already have tons of hate in their heart, and they are there. The hate because they hate, and that's evidence from first source. And when you use that language, when you not educate, when you feel comfortable saying in your speech, Hitler was right, and you're a US elected official, when you compare Governor J.B. Pritzker to Hitler and the stay-at-home order to concentration camps, that's a foul. When you compare the situation, again, I repeat it, at the southern border of the United States, the concentration camps, and refusing to apologize, that's a problem. So I think it's a combination of both. It's both being very cynically and sarcastically used by a lot of public figure, but I think it's being legitimized right now by growing drifting world where there are one side and clear two sides of the aisle, and those sides pretty often fueling those masses and those haters and those angry people that will later translate that anger and that frustration and God knows what into anti-Semitism.
Well, so maybe this will be the last question I ask before we start taking questions from the audience out there. But Daniel, along these lines, we now have a member of the United States Congress who blamed Jewish bankers for fires in California. The old cliche, the old slur, the old blood libel. Why is this happening now? What's your interpretation of this, and what can we do about it?
For people who use these kind of things, I don't really think it's worth our time analyzing why, because I think it says more on them than reality. And I think that what goes around and the surrounding things, and whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a war, people who have these dark mindsets about people in general and have these stereotypes who we thought were gone from this world. And because they're not gone, therefore Alice's job is more important than ever, to make sure that if it's not gone by now, it should be gone in the near future, because no one in this world should continue to think about Jews, or again, stereotypes about any race, any gender, any religion, the way that these things sound. So I think this is a message that should be to any person around the world, whether Congress, whether it's a farmer, whether it's a taxi driver, a professor in the university, because we hear these things. It would have been easy to dismiss if you would say, it's from a low-class person, not educated, who says these things, he has these stereotypes. But history shows us again that anti-Semitism, the most dangerous anti-Semitism came from the intellectual class in Europe, and later on it came from bottom up and top bottom. Therefore, we need to remember that these things you need to fight it in all levels. We need to make sure that anti-Semitism is something that people understand, not only how idiotic it is, but how dangerous it is and what it leads to. So we need to always make it through education, dialogue, and then also, of course, by laws. So when we know there are laws against it, legislation needs to be punishment, but also it needs to come from education, that people understand what they're talking about has absolutely no sense.
Yeah, it has to be part of our culture. Allison, I think maybe this is a good time to bring in some
thank you.
questions.
For some reason, I'm having trouble putting my camera back on, so I apologize. It's my voice. I'll play with it as we're speaking. But a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank everybody. This is an extraordinary conversation. And there are a few questions out there. One is, we're hearing a lot of comparisons about, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? We're seeing it on college campuses. There's a lot of anti-Semitism on college campus, or people who are anti-Zionist say, but I'm not an anti-Semite. So I'm asking, I don't know which panelist wants to answer, but how do you feel about that? You work and support, You know, the state of Israel, every single day, we're all very traumatized by the Holocaust. It's affected your personal lives, and we're witnessing an uptick in anti-Semitism. But can you equate the two?
Do you want me to answer? Do you want to answer?
Go ahead.
So I will just say that this is a topic that where I'm speaking in campuses on a daily basis with students, Jewish students and non-Jewish students, to address this question. This is becoming the hot potato, the debate that people are trying to either avoid or embrace or discuss or get out of it as soon as possible. Why? Because there's a very, very thin line between anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and legitimate criticism. And this is a very hard line to identify. And if we don't know how to define it and identify it, it's going to be very hard to tackle it. What do I mean by that? That we need to make sure that we know how to differentiate between those who would not want to join the foreign ministry like we did and represent the state of Israel. And it's completely legitimate to have legitimate criticism on certain policies of the government on the one hand. There could be someone who has a problem, ideological problem with the way that the state of Israel is going, and he thinks or she thinks that there are some changes that they want, which we don't see in the same eye, but we can sit and discuss. And then those who use the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as an excuse for anti-Semitism. So by denying the existence of the state of Israel and saying that Israel is doing 1, 2, 3 to the Palestinians, and I saw one of the questions here in the chat about the comparison. So Israel is the Nazis, Israel is apartheid, Israel is all of that. One thing saying that we think that a certain policy in the West Bank that Israel is doing is wrong, then saying the state of Israel is an apartheid state or a Nazi state and their soldiers are Nazis. And therefore, and I hear these voices in campuses and BDS operations here, they say it out loud in campuses, very intellectual, very sophisticated, young Muslims and non-Muslims who stated publicly, saying the state of Israel should not exist. The state of Israel is a colonialist, imperial institution, which we discussed before. It's not based, and they say Holocaust, we don't need to suffer because of these European Holocaust survivors. And this narrative is a very, very dangerous narrative, which is very, very close to anti-Semitism, if it's not anti-Semitism, and many times it's very clear anti-Semitism. But yet again, the anti-Zionism is a lot of times combined with anti-Semitism. It's just another excuse because it's getting more legitimization from the public. Because to say to someone, because you are a Jew, you can't live in the state of Israel is not in the bon ton today. It's something that is not accepted by the public. But if you'd say to someone, I'm against Zionism, then it's a legitimate discussion suddenly in campuses. But one needs to understand that when you say you are anti-Zionist, you are for the extinction of the state, the Jewish state, which has consequences. Therefore, we all need to be more careful, more sensitive, to remember to embrace those who have legitimate criticism and to take aside those who are anti-Semites and fight them.
You know, it pains me how fashionable and trendy and fashionable it is to hate Israel on campuses. And not only that, but to even harass and terrorize young Jewish students on campus. This is considered okay. And these criticisms that are aimed at Israel are never aimed at China, Russia, Cuba, other terrible authoritarian regimes, only Israel. And that's always been the case, and it seems to be the case now. And I find that very, very painful that American universities often are like that.
Howard, it's not just American universities. We're watching human rights injustices all over the world. And if you look at the UN, the only obvious country that they are always having a resolution against is Israel. I mean, that's a whole different discussion, not for today, but thank you. There is another question that I think would be germane to this conversation, and it's someone who said they are a psychologist and a second-generation Holocaust survivor. You three are, Howard, you're second generation also, but the three guests are from the Israel Consulate are third-generation survivors like this person's children. How much trauma do you believe has been passed on to your generation, and how do we address these issues?
Well, okay, please, Yael, go ahead.
Sorry,
Please.
I misunderstood. I think it's really personal in a lot of ways. It depends where you live in, but I want to listen to you, Howard. Please continue.
No, please, no, you, ladies first.
There are a lot of things that are going through generations after generations, of course. There are a lot of traumas. As I said before, I was afraid for a long time of my life just to say that I was Jewish, because I was born in a non-Jewish place, and most of my friends are non-Jewish, and they all believe, or they're really close to these rumors and the things about the Holocaust and Convergence, and they don't understand the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So for one side, it's really personal, whatever happened in each family, but there are a lot of things that we all have in common. All those fears, all those traumas, all those personal things that we cannot talk about it. And though that pain, basically, the families, the generations, they're still carrying the weight on their shoulders on that pain, that shame, that guilt that happened back then. We all carry that without even realizing. But please, Howard, continue.
No, I mean, I totally agree. And the medical literature shows that these traumas travel through the generations, that traumatic behaviors travel through the generations. This has been documented. And well, we don't have to look further than the United States. I think we still see the effects of America's original sin, slavery, playing out today. We still haven't even dealt with that. So I think it's no surprise that these traumas are with us and will be with us for a long time. And the only way I can think of dealing with it as a writer is to talk and write. And that's what we're all doing here today.
I think these conversations are important as well, because unfortunately the statistics say, in my original introduction, I said, this day and age, if you say Simon Wiesenthal, 90% of the world doesn't even know who he was and what his legacy was. And the other aspect of is that let's look at the statistics of the millennials. I think, was it 70% of the millennials in the last study never heard the word Auschwitz. The education, these conversations are so important. That's why we just are kicking off the Mobile Museum of Tolerance to bring this education to the schools. When Rabbi Marvin Heyer, the founder and dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, wanted to build what he thought at the time was only going to be a museum, because there were no Holocaust museums more than 40 years ago in the United States. And when he met Mr. Wiesenthal said, Rabbi, if you want to memorialize the past, I'll give you a letter of recommendation. If you want the center to bear my name, you will memorialize the past, work today to change tomorrow. It's not the first and the last genocide, Holocaust, anti-Semitic issue that's going to happen. And that's how we became an international Jewish human rights organization. But as Jews, as those who've had the trauma of the Holocaust, even if it's third generation down, what do you say to people who ask you, so should we care about the genocides of others? We have so much anti-Semitism right now to deal with, unfortunately. Look, we're about to celebrate another holiday coming up, Purim. What is Purim celebrating? Once again, someone tried to annihilate us. Thank God they didn't. Let's eat. I mean, that's who we are. That's what we're always celebrating. But how do you respond to the person that's the Jew that says, why should we worry about the other? We have enough of our own. So what if 6,000 women and children were just killed in Nigeria because they were Christian? Is that our responsibility as well? How do you feel about that as generations of survivors?
Ron,
can you repeat it, Alison?
Ron, you there? Yeah, you're there, Ron.
Can you repeat it? I lost you for a second. Sure.
How do you feel as a Jew when other Jews say to you, why should we care about the suffering of someone else? We have our own sorrows. We've got our own problems. We've got to worry about the state of Israel. We have to worry about the anti-Semitism that we're experiencing. So why should we care that Nigerians or Christians are being killed? Is that our responsibility? How do you feel about that kind of question?
I think Daniel's answer from earlier summarized it beautifully. It's all of our responsibility to ensure never again, not only for us, for everyone, Muslim, Christian, in Nigeria, in Myanmar, in Hong Kong, in Syria, everywhere. And why? Because the legitimization of one Holocaust, let's call it, the legitimization of, I'm struggling with this word, of another. It starts here and God knows where it stops. So for all we know, you could be next.
And it's in our Passover Haggadah. We're supposed to comfort the sick, feed the hungry, embrace the other, open the door.
Let me look if there's another question, sorry. Oops, sorry. No, I think, well, also it's coming to the close of the 6:30 time as well. I think it would be a good opportunity if each person, including you, Howard, because it's your own personal experience as well, growing up as the son of survivors. If you have a minute closing remark that you would like to leave our attendees with.
Yeah, I would like to say that I remain optimistic about the future because of people like you. And I talk and I write, but you guys are in the consulate office and you're out there at the front lines really doing this work. You know, this is your daily work. And I feel great gratitude to you for what you do. And I would like to ask you this closing question. Are you optimistic about the change that you are all trying to make in the world?
Ladies first, Yael.
I am optimistic most of the time. There are days that they're not going that well. Sometimes I get afraid of what I see, what's going on in the world. Lately here in the US, you know, interrupting the Capitol and stuff like that, it's scary. But at the same time, I do agree with what you're saying. There are a lot of people working really hard to make the best, to educate, to try to pass on their stories. We are trying to, through our experiences, to other people, to get to other people, to try to share all those things that we do have in common. We really need to look more out of what we have in common instead of our differences, and trying to be more tolerant in a way that even when someone doesn't agree with us, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. Sometimes it doesn't feel that way, especially for young people. If you don't agree with me, then I stop talking to you, and that shouldn't be the way. There are better days than others, but by the end of the day, we all have to remember, even during the darkest times, we can see the light. That was a really beautiful phrase that it was made some time ago, that during the dark, you only see the stars. So we should all be optimistic. So yeah. Ryan?
All I need to do to gain optimism is open my Facebook page 2 days ago and see a lovely article in ABC Chicago about the Simon Wiesenthal Center Massive Education Museum. I think that sums it up beautifully. That's how you do education creatively, while including everyone with no differential with all races, colors, genders. I think that's how you do it. So yeah, when I see creative initiative like that, I'm optimistic.
I would like to end this by talking about the elephant in the room. No, we didn't mention once the word COVID since we started an hour ago. I mean, we are now facing, and this is a lesson of proportion. Now we are in these black cubes. Unfortunately, this is an event I'd be very happy that all of us would sit in a panel with you, discuss it face to face, engage, see emotions and not seeing only screens. And this is the reality we are living in, and very hopefully it's the end of this reality. At least in Israel, we are starting to begin to maybe see the light in the end of the tunnel. I'm very trying to be realistic. But why am I saying this? Because eventually we need to have some proportions here. We were talking now about the Holocaust, and people sometimes forget what our grandparents needed to pass in their life. People lived through world wars. People lived through pandemics. People lived through the darkest times. We need to say thank you for every minute that we can work from home It means we have a home and we have work.
Yeah.
And it means we are talking to people. It means that we have people to talk to. So if this is our situation, we need to keep briut, good health for ourselves, good company. And remember, death is not something only, this our grandparents can tell us, not only something physically, you can die also from within. Therefore, it's our responsibility today to look at our neighbors, our friends, our family who are sitting alone in the darkness in their homes during COVID, invite them, talk to them, engage with them, because the spirit in the Holocaust, what the people passed it, is because they were together, believing and hoping and thinking and living together and believing. And this is a message to all of you. I think this is what I think, this is the most important thing we have today. Being together, be strong, and pray for the best. Toda Rabba for hosting this important event. We look forward to working together with you, Howard, with you, Alison, on many more events in the future. Thank you, Yael and Ran, for actually having the idea to host this together with Alison, and I'm just the guest here. But thank you very much for hosting this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Daniel, for leaving us with a message of emunah, of hope. It's a beautiful way to end this. I want to thank all of you for bringing this together. And we're getting, just so you know, on the chat, everybody is thanking all of you profusely for sharing your stories. I think this was a well-received. Thank you. Thank you to the Israeli Consulate, who's been an incredible partner with the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And let's continue educating everybody about the atrocities of the past so that we can make sure that we do change the future. Never again has to mean something.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
And for those who are asking, we did record it. We are going to send it out via email tomorrow, and you are welcome to share it with your friends and neighbors who were not unable to join us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.